It's the value of working for a charity. It teaches you to do a lot of stuff for yourself. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm Tom from the NAS. I'm Policy and Participation Officer. It's a great mouthful of a job title. I sort of do local campaigning across central England and nationally, supporting particularly people with autism, children with autism, to be involved with campaigns, participation, having their voice heard where they live. I'm also the father of a 12-year-old young man with autism who I don't regard myself necessarily as the expert parent. That's not why it's called this. But I do feel like more than anything else I do, he teaches me the things I need to know and the things that guide my work. And really it's why I've ended up working for the NAS. It wasn't just a coincidence. So congratulations to the RSA for their amazing planning of getting this day on World Autism Awareness Day, which I understand was a complete accident. But that makes it all the more remarkable. I've been doing lots of radio interviews and sorts of things all day. It's been a great day, and the NAS, to coincide with it, has done Onesie Wednesday. I don't know if anyone's seen that. People have been wearing onesies across the country. Just if anyone's concerned, I am wearing a onesie. It's just beneath everything else. So, just before I start, just show of hands, how many parents of children or adult children who are either autism or neurodiverse in the audience? Quite a lot. You'll be the people I'll look at to see if you're nodding as I speak through. Much of what I'll be talking about is drawn from the NAS's research, which is not so much the research that Simon's been talking about, and he'd probably balk at some of our data gathering methods. And a lot of it is as well the experiences we hear from parents and children with autism about how they experience the world and how they are supported or otherwise. So the expert parent. So what do I mean by the expert parent, really? Sadly, the experience for parents is still one of a fight and a battle for services and support for their children, whether that's young children or adult children. And it's a fight that starts really with recognition and diagnosis. It moves through to a fight for appropriate support, whether that's appropriate education or short breaks, all those sorts of things for children, appropriate social support, or for actual long-term support for when their children become adults and want to live an independent life. And what parents really are trying to do is support their child in the best way so they can make the most of their talents and live an independent as possible life, which is as fulfilling as possible, which is the same as what we'd all expect. But sadly, that is a battle. But along the way, the parent does tend to become the expert parent through that battle, and they learn what works for their child, what challenges their child in a positive and a negative way, and what it is their child has to offer the world. So my view is that the best professionals are those that support that journey and learn from it as well, because let's face it, across their lives, children with autism spend most of their time being supported by their parents, and any good professional would learn from that. So I'm going to start with diagnosis and the importance of diagnosis. And the NAS view is that diagnosis is critical, and what we mean by that is the correct diagnosis at the right time, and one which actually supports and helps the family. So it's a diagnosis which helps explain, but not necessarily excuse behaviours. So it's there to illuminate, it's there to provide insight and understanding into some of those experiences that those children are having. It's about helping to identify how to support a child and what interventions might actually work. And it can actually ultimately be a positive act It's about taking an experience which, to that point, has probably been very confusing for a parent, very scary, has been quite chaotic. Your experiences have been vastly different from those of your other friends who've having children at the same time, and it can provide an explanation, but more than that, it can be empowering, and it can provide a way forward, and it can give the imperative back to the parents to do something, to be that help that they have always wanted to be for their child. So this is drawn from Great Expectations, one of our campaigns around education specifically. It was a parent of a child with autism said, "I think we'd be listened to more if we had the diagnosis. I wouldn't be fighting the school every 2 minutes because he'd have things in place." So that is commonly the experience for parents when there isn't a diagnosis in place, that they feel they have nothing to refer back to. They have no official reason for schools or whoever professionals might be to sit up and take notice. So from our research, and this does actually cross children and adults, 34% of people that we surveyed, this was from our 50th survey, so it was the 50th year of the NES, and it was the biggest survey of people with autism that's ever been done in the UK. 34% of people reported that they'd waited 3 years or more for diagnosis after first raising concerns, with a further 30% saying it had taken between 1 and 2 years. So almost 2/3 waiting more than a year from first raising concerns. As a result, 55% who responded to our survey reported it took too long to get a diagnosis, and half said that the process was too stressful. 61% who responded to our survey said they felt relieved to get a diagnosis, and 58% said the diagnosis led to getting new or more support. I think that latter stat's actually slightly higher amongst children and probably significantly lower amongst adults, but nonetheless, it's definitely the case that diagnosis is key to unlocking that support. And just something additional, which I think is quite relevant tonight, is that the gender split as well. So just 1/5 of the females who were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism, just 1/5 of females were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism by the age of 11, as compared to half of males. So those women that had Asperger's syndrome were often waiting far beyond age 11 to receive their diagnosis. So if we're talking about those neurodiverse people, neurodiverse women with talents, who are finding themselves and their behaviour not understood, the vast majority are waiting beyond early childhood, almost to teen years, before they're receiving a diagnosis. And even then, they were more likely to be misdiagnosed, with 42% being diagnosed with other conditions compared to 30% of males. The female issue is often referred to misdiagnosis or missed diagnosis, and too often we hear stories of women reaching certainly into the middle of their lives before they're actually receiving appropriate diagnosis, having lived years with inappropriate and inaccurate diagnoses, which have actually been harmful rather than helpful. So a phrase that we hear quite a lot at the NES is labels, and usually in a negative context. We often hear from families that the school or the health visitor or the GP have told them that, yes, your child might have some problems, but we don't like to label children. I've never really understood that myself. Like Simon, I take a view that labels are helpful for many reasons, but I think more than anything else, at the NAS, we're quite happy to label people autistic and use the term Asperger's syndrome because we don't see them as negative terms. We think there are many positives about being neurodiverse and having a different view in the world, and yes, people need support. But actually they are not in themselves negative terms. So we don't have a problem with people being labelled. As far as I'm concerned, the negative labels are naughty child or defiant or disruptive. These are unhelpful labels because they don't in themselves explain, support, or actually illuminate beyond or do anything beyond creating additional barriers. Sadly, labels are the best we've got as well. Diagnostic labels exist because that is the way in which conditions are diagnosed. They have to be given a name. It's the best we can do. They unlock access to benefits and support. If anyone thinks that labels are unhelpful or unnecessary, I challenge them to apply for disability living allowance without a diagnosis and without a label, and come back to me and tell me that they're unnecessary. As I say, they're also key to unlocking insight and understanding, not just for the family, but so a family can then explain to often wider family members who perhaps haven't really understood why there's been this child that doesn't fit in with the family, or why they can't come along to family occasions in the same way that other people can. They now have a way to explain that and a name to give things. And labels also describe patterns of behaviour, diverse patterns of behaviour, and they tell parents how different behaviours interact with each other, that two things which may seem very different actually have that common cause. And in doing so, you can start to identify how to support those different patterns of behaviour. But each child is an individual. So beyond the label exists the child. And that individual is going to be as different as any of us in the room. What's probably now becoming the cliche is that when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But that's always true, and I've never met any two people with autism who are the same, because why would one expect to, given that I've never met two neurotypical people who are the same. Diagnostic boundaries aren't perfect. It's a spectrum condition. People often ask me, where is my son on the spectrum? I completely fail to give an answer every time, because I don't think it's as simple as that. Lorna Wing has the excellent term, much more eloquently than I could put, which is that nature never draws a line without smudging it, which I absolutely love, because I think that, more than anything else, really describes this notion of the autism spectrum as something which is a spectrum of needs, of abilities, of shifting abilities and needs in different situations. We need to remember that all behaviour is communication as well, and that essentially when certain behaviours are being displayed, that child is telling us something, and it's something which we need to be listening to and responding to, and that all support should be dictated by need and not the labels themselves. And in an ideal world, perhaps there wouldn't be a need for labels, and that all support would be allocated on the basis of need and proper understanding of the individual. But sadly, that's not where we are today, and therefore we feel that those labels and diagnostic, getting a diagnosis is still hugely necessary. So Simon's talked about overlapping conditions, and I will as well. Comorbidities is a phrase I absolutely hate, but there we go, it's what we have. Autism is not a mental health condition, but recent studies showed that as many as 71% of children with autism have some form of a mental health problem. Anxiety disorders, depression, OCD, and 40% have two or more. Equally, I know that we're talking about high-functioning neurodiverse people today, but this idea of intellectual disability, the stats are actually wide-ranging in terms of the figure that studies give, but approximately 50% of young people with autism have an IQ of below 70. The reason that's a slightly imperfect, well, a very imperfect stat is that actually that is very dependent on the environment, it's very dependent on what you're measuring, and the fact that actually people with autism tend to have what we refer to as very spotty profiles, so high areas of great strength, and then other areas of perhaps deficits in intellectual terms. Other comorbidities, epilepsy, dyspraxia, ADHD. It's my understanding, and I don't say this as a diagnostician, that until DSM-5, the latest diagnostic manual for America, a co-diagnosis of ADHD and autism could not be made. Now, I'm sure a lot of the parents around the room would know that the two can coexist, but it's my understanding that until DSM-5, a co-diagnosis could not be made. So that essentially means that the figures around this are very bad because we don't know how many people officially have both. And all of these comorbidities, I think, fall into three different categories. So we're talking about labels sometimes being used for particular patterns of disability or behaviour that can be found amongst people with autism. So that's talking about things like semantic pragmatic disorder, non-verbal learning disorder. That's patterns of behaviour that's seen in autism as well. Developmental disorders which are not regarded as part of the autism spectrum, but often occur together with an autistic spectrum disorder, so ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia. And then physical conditions affecting the brain that can be associated with autistic spectrum disorders, so Fragile X, Rett syndrome, those sorts of things. The important thing to remember through all of this, to bring it back to the needs of the child, is that essentially it's highly likely that any child with autism is going to have another co-occurring condition, and that focusing just on that condition and focusing just on the label is not going to achieve anything positive. So how do you achieve something positive? Well, it's to come back to the expert parent, and it's about listening to and involving the parent in everything that happens with the child. This is going to become more and more common, and for any professional out there, it's something which you should be building into the way you work, because it's becoming more and more enshrined in legislation more than anything else, that actually involvement of parents is becoming a duty itself. So the new SEN system, expected to be implemented from September this year, has a duty to involve parents and children right across the system. That's about putting together the different sorts of support which are available across health, education and care in a local area. It's about the needs of that child and what support they can expect in the school. There is a duty to involve. That means parents must be listened to. Express involvement in the diagnostic process. The NICE clinical guidance for diagnosis of children actually includes in there a recommendation that if a parent disagrees with the diagnosis given, that is a reason by itself to seek a second opinion. So essentially parents should be being given a veto almost through the diagnostic process. If they don't agree with what they're being told, they can seek a second opinion, and that the clinician should be seeking the second opinion, not the parent. Importantly, parents need to be listened to because they will see behaviour not witnessed at other times. So the common story that we're told is about the child who actually holds it together during school. They kind of keep a lid on things, that just about getting through the day. Perhaps the anxiety is going up and up and up throughout the day. They come home and that's when it all comes out. We see meltdowns and we see challenging behaviour, and we see parents struggling to cope and not being supported, and then the worst of all, not being believed because that's not how the child is at school. And that could be for a variety of reasons. Some say the school environment, whilst it may not always be the most appropriate for a child, bigger schools, as someone mentioned earlier, actually there are social rules within schools which are often taught to children, and whilst they might be having a very bad time with school, you can understand the social rules whilst you're there, and you can kind of keep it together because someone tells you need to be good. And I think particularly for children with high functioning autism, that is often the case. And parents will also be the best placed to know their child's strengths and talents and know actually what the environment and the circumstances are that the child can best show those talents. They'll know where they can perform best, what's going to trigger a meltdown, what's going to enable them to really perform to the best of their abilities. And these are all the things which need to be listened to from parents and need to be included in any support given to a child. So acting early, and I think 20 past 8 is supposed to be early there, which doesn't really work, especially if any parent with a child with autism around the room will know that it's not early. 48% of parents had to, and this is for children specifically, so 48% of parents had to wait over a year to get appropriate support following diagnosis. More than a quarter have waited over 2 years, 15% waited more than 3 years. So even when a diagnosis is being achieved, there can still be that battle for the support, for that diagnosis to be believed, for that diagnosis to be recognised and put into a process of action, wherever that might be. I don't know how well people will be able to see this, but this is a chart showing the impact of a lack of timely support. Essentially, high purple bars is bad. So around 60-70% from our survey were saying that a lack of timely support had a negative effect on their child across a range of things, so educational progress, self-esteem, behaviour, social and communication skills, mental health, and even 40% were reporting negative impacts on the physical health of the child. So we know that a lack of timely support, a lack of early intervention following diagnosis, or even a late diagnosis, can have a huge impact on the well-being of that child and that family more widely as well. Mel will be talking a bit more about interventions and things, but the research around interventions is still not hugely strong. The best evidence suggests that communication-based psychosocial interventions, which are delivered in partnership with parents, are the most effective. That's all sorts of things from many months of working with a family, using video cameras to record how they interact with the child in their own home. It can be things like the NAS has the Early Bird and Early Bird Plus, which is very much about early intervention because that's preschool, and it's about empowering parents to have insight into their child, to learn techniques and to support their child with that. 96%, I think, is the figure of parents who do Early Bird say that they feel better able to support their child, which is a marvellous figure for us. I'm sure that for other sorts of interventions, I know that some areas use something called Signet, and of course we have Advance in the room who do very similar work, wonderful work, and I'm sure that their satisfaction rates are through the roof. But to bring it back to this idea of the expert parent, all of this work, diagnosis through to listening and involvement, through to early intervention, relies on really strong relationships where the parents feel in control and that they are trusted to be that expert parent. Because without that trust and without that control, you're never going to get to a situation where the child can be fulfilling their potential and making the best of their talents. Thank you very much.